This video is sponsored by BetterHelp. More on them in a little bit. We've all heard the old saying countless times that if something sounds too good to be true, then it probably is. But let's be honest, when faced with a genuinely tempting offer, how many of us can really say that we've never gone against our own better judgment? That we've never caved to that little voice inside our heads that tells us that we might be missing out on the deal of a lifetime? In most situations, giving in and satisfying our curiosity ends up being relatively harmless. A waste of time and maybe money, but nothing more. Of course, that's not always how things play out. Sometimes that shiny thing luring us in is concealing something truly insidious. Sadly, that's precisely what happened with the people at the center of today's story. Unfortunately, by the time anyone realized what was really going on, the only thing left was a series of dark and mysterious clues. Ones that would take years to fully unpack before a haunting truth was finally revealed. On the afternoon of February 6th, 2002, officers from Arizona's Phoenix Police Department set out to conduct a welfare check at a local residence. They had received calls that day from several people, all of whom said they were concerned about the same man and woman, 58-year-old Charles Chuck Russell and his 42-year-old fiancée, Cathy Nelson. Among those who had reached out were the couple's two employers. They explained that Chuck and Cathy, who were normally very reliable, had each now missed 3 days of work in a row without so much as a phone call. When police arrived at the property, located in Phoenix's Golden Keys Central neighborhood, there were no vehicles parked outside and no answer at the front door. They peered through some of the windows, but couldn't see anything that stood out there either. In fact, if it weren't for the newspapers that were piling up on the driveway, there would have been nothing to suggest that Chuck and Cathy had been gone for any considerable length of time. Despite the lack of anything outwardly suspicious, officers decided that because of the number of reports they had received, they would enter the house and have a look around. At first, it was very much the same story in here as it had been outside. The couple's home was spotless, and nothing appeared to be out of place or stolen. Cathy's wallet was gone, but her purse and a bunch of its contents were in one of the home's bathrooms. Chuck's work computer was plugged into its charger and was sitting neatly on the dining room table. It was like the pair had just stepped out to run some errands and they would be coming right back. As officers took a closer look, though, they started to find other signs that the house had been sitting empty for several days. The last activity on Chuck's computer was from nearly a week earlier, and the light on his and Cathy's answering machine was blinking with numerous unchecked messages. Though none of these details were necessarily cause for alarm, there was one thing that police found deeply unnerving. You see, while there was no sign of either Chuck or Cathy, their dog was still inside the house. The animal's food and water bowls were completely empty, and it looked like they had been that way for some time. It was enough that the officers who responded to the scene decided to go back to the station and file a missing persons report. As they did this, they began calling some of the numbers that had left voicemails on the couple's answering machine. Most of these messages had been left by family members, who it turned out were quite concerned about Chuck and Cathy as well. One of Cathy's sisters, Lori Ursland, told police that she had been worried about the fact that Cathy hadn't been returning her calls. That being said, neither she nor the other family members had realized just how serious and strange the situation was. Just to give you an idea, when she was informed that her sister was missing, Lori's first reaction was to ask if Chuck had any details. She would later recall in an interview how her heart dropped when she was told that he was missing too. When authorities explained a little more about the mysterious situation they had found inside Chuck and Cathy's home, Lori and other loved ones were adamant that it was completely out of character for them to just take off like this. They also said that there was no way they wouldn't have made arrangements for their dog to be looked after if they were planning on being away from the house for more than a few hours. Through these conversations, police learned that the last time any family members had heard from Chuck and Cathy was the night of February 1st. After launching a formal investigation, Phoenix police returned to the couple's home to see if there was anything that they had missed. They also carried out canvassing in the neighborhood, looking for anyone who might have seen something suspicious over the last few days. The search of the house proved to be just as confusing as it had been the first time. There were absolutely no signs of violence or foul play. In fact, there weren't really any additional clues of any kind. The canvassing effort was more helpful, but only slightly. No one in the gated community had witnessed anything out of the ordinary, though a few said that they had noticed that Chuck and Cathy's red Ford Lightning pickup truck had been missing from their driveway for several days. At least one neighbor also mentioned being concerned about the couple's dog. They said that the animal had been barking a lot and seemed agitated. At one point, they went as far as to feed the dog over the concrete dividing wall around the property because it looked like it wasn't being taken care of. At this point, authorities still had no solid proof that any kind of crime had been committed, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right here, particularly when it came to those details about Chuck and Cathy's dog. Unfortunately, this gut instinct was about to be proven correct. It began when police stumbled across a series of unsettling clues, ones that suggested that the couple could be in serious danger. You know, some of the most frequent questions that I get in the comment section of our videos are from people who are curious about what kind of impact reading and writing about true crime so often has had on my mental health. It's something that I also get asked about a lot in my personal life whenever I meet someone new and they learn what kind of content I make on YouTube. When Luke and I first started the channel, I'll admit, this was something I didn't really think about, but I was definitely caught off guard by the emotional weight that I felt researching and covering many of these stories, particularly as we started to do more deep dive style videos and I found myself spending a lot more time with individual cases, and as a result, a lot more time learning about the people involved, especially the victims. In fact, it's one of the reasons that I started adding the final thought segment to these videos, as a way to kind of gather my thoughts and decompress a bit after wading through such heavy subject matter. Now, all of that being said, one of the things that I always tell people is that while my situation might seem kind of unique, it really isn't. And that's because you don't have to be immersing yourself in crime stories every day for your mental health to be something you should take seriously. The truth is that resources like therapy are something that we can all benefit from. One way to do that is with today's sponsor, BetterHelp. BetterHelp connects you with a licensed therapist who is trained to listen and give you helpful, unbiased advice. The process is easy. You just go to their site, answer a few questions, and BetterHelp will match you to a professional who has years of experience helping people just like you. What's even cooler is that you can do all of this in the way that works best for you. Your computer, over the phone, video chat, or messaging, however you feel most comfortable. It's the easiest possible way to start talking to a therapist. To get started and learn more about how BetterHelp can connect you to a therapist who can support you, all from the comfort of your own home, visit betterhelp.com/crimezone or choose Crime Zone during sign up and enjoy a special discount on your first month. You can also check out the link in the description below. Thanks, BetterHelp. After discovering the mysterious scene at Chuck and Cathy's home and finding out that no one had heard from them for several days, Phoenix police were now confident that they hadn't simply run off somewhere. At the same time, there was really no evidence to go off of that appeared to offer any hint as to what had actually happened. Detectives decided that their best bet was to learn as much information as they could about the couple, hoping that this might reveal a direction for them to continue the investigation. Those close to Chuck and Cathy told authorities that at first they were surprised by their relationship. Chuck had been married previously, but after his wife died tragically, it seemed like he had given up on love. He had carried the pain of that loss with him for a long time, and at one point he had even said that he would never be with anyone else. That changed when he met Cathy, though. She was fun and full of life, and slowly Chuck began to open up his heart again. According to family members, the couple's personalities meshed well together. They were both carefree at heart, but were also hardworking and valued their careers. Chuck was a top salesman at the medical supply company where he worked, Physician Sales and Service. Cathy, meanwhile, had a good job with the Maricopa County Assessor's Office, a local government body in charge of determining the value of commercial and residential real estate. Unfortunately, none of the sources we came across delved much further into Chuck and Cathy's personal lives. In fact, most contradicted each other even about the amount of time they'd been together. Some sources said 17 years, while others said 12. What we do know is that they had been living together for at least 7 years at the time they went missing. It seems that police also struggled with this to some degree, because no matter how many questions they asked about the couple, they weren't able to uncover much of anything in their personal or professional lives that would explain their sudden disappearances. Neither of them had done anything like this before. Neither had any history of legal or mental issues, and neither had any enemies to speak of. Cathy's father did alert detectives to one possibility. He said that a little while ago his daughter had told him about a potentially shady situation with some land that she was looking into at work. She explained that there might be some sort of fraud going on, and that this involved a very valuable piece of property. But when authorities looked into this, they discovered that the situation had already been investigated and resolved. In the end, everything had turned out to be legitimate. Understandably, the fact that detectives were coming up with so little so early on was not a good sign. Before they had an opportunity to dwell on this, though, the case had already taken yet another unsettling turn. It began on the morning of February 7th, when Phoenix PD detectives were contacted by their counterparts in the city of Tucson. They said that they were pretty sure that they had found Chuck and Cathy's red Ford Lightning pickup truck. As it turned out, the truck had actually been discovered a couple of days earlier. It had been left in a parking lot outside of the Santa Cruz Catholic Church, located on the south side of the city. Congregants at the church had first called police about the vehicle after noticing that it had been there for a few days and appeared to be abandoned. There were no keys inside, but the driver's side door was unlocked. Officers checked the situation out, but at the time, Cathy and Chuck hadn't been reported missing. It was only after the vehicle had been towed to a nearby impound lot and the plates were run again that morning that they discovered that the truck was now the subject of a statewide bulletin that had been put out by the Phoenix Police Department. To say that this was a strange development would have been an understatement. The parking lot where the abandoned pickup truck was found was more than 120 miles from Chuck and Cathy's home. Moreover, from speaking to those close to the couple, detectives already knew that they had no ties to the Tucson area. They didn't have family members there, nor were loved ones aware of any trip that they were planning on taking there. To investigators, this was more disturbing confirmation that something was seriously wrong. Like Chuck and Cathy's house, the pickup truck didn't show any obvious signs of foul play. There was no blood and no signs of a struggle or anything like that, which would have indicated anything violent had taken place there. In the bed of the pickup truck, there was a ramp that looked like it might be used to wheel things up there. The most notable discoveries, though, were made in the vehicle's glove box. These included a checkbook that belonged to Chuck, a receipt for a $12,000 cashier's check, and a revolver. Of course, the revolver was the first thing that caught detectives' attention, but it turned out that it actually belonged to Chuck as well. The weapon also hadn't been fired recently, meaning that it probably wasn't directly involved in whatever was going on here. Still, the question remained, what was all of this stuff doing here anyway? Investigators hoped that by sending the pickup truck away for further forensic analysis, they might be able to uncover additional clues. In the meantime, they turned their attention to another one of the items that they had found in the glove box. It was about to lead them down quite the disturbing rabbit hole. After finding Chuck and Cathy's abandoned pickup truck well over 100 miles from their home, detectives with the Phoenix Police Department were growing increasingly worried that the missing couple were in danger. What kind of danger wasn't exactly clear, and this made the situation all the more disturbing. It appears that authorities weren't the only ones that felt this way. because it was the discovery of the truck that really caught the attention of the public as well. Local and state media outlets began covering the story extensively, and details of the case began to spread like wildfire. These efforts were helped along considerably by Chuck and Cathy's family members, who gave as many interviews as they could expressing their concerns. They also began a large effort distributing missing persons flyers with information about the couple across both the Phoenix and Tucson areas. In one of the many media interviews around this time, Cathy's sister Lori spoke about the awful state of helpless limbo she and the other family members were in, and about how they were struggling to cope without any kind of answers. She told reporters, in part, quote, "This is a living nightmare. We can't work, we can't sleep, we can't eat. We're just walking around in a daze." Fortunately, the publicity would help to generate several new leads. One of these leads turned out to be incredibly important and would help to unravel several of the mysteries at the heart of the unsettling case. It began when Phoenix detectives received a call from the owner of a local motorcycle shop. Now, prior to this, one of the things that police had learned about Chuck and Cathy was that a lot of their free time revolved around vintage cars and motorcycles. Chuck had always had a passion for racing, riding, and collecting, and over the past few years, he had gotten Cathy hooked as well. When authorities learned this, they immediately began calling around to local hospitals, wondering if Chuck and Cathy had been in some kind of accident, maybe while they were out on one of their bikes. They had searched statewide to see if there were any people matching their descriptions at any of these hospitals, but this had come up empty. The next thing the detectives considered was that the couple's disappearances might be related to the collecting side of their hobby. Chuck, in particular, had been buying and selling cars and motorcycles for years, and Cathy would often accompany him on these deals. This theory was plausible, but there wasn't a lot of additional information that police had been able to find backing this up. That was, until they received this call from the motorcycle shop owner. The man explained that Chuck and Cathy had come into his shop on the morning of February 2nd, and that Chuck had been looking for some advice. He said that he had seen an ad for a Ducati motorcycle in one of the local newspapers, and was thinking about buying it. He had managed to talk the guy who had listed it down on his asking price, a few $100, to $12,000, and he wanted to know if it was a good deal. The shop owner took a look at the classified ad and said, "Yeah, this was a pretty amazing find. This specific model of bike was worth close to 18 grand, and according to the listing, it only had 130 miles on it." After hearing this, Chuck said that he was thinking the same thing, and that he had already arranged to meet the seller a little later that day. He asked to borrow some tie-downs because if the sale went through, he and Cathy were going to be transporting the bike in their pickup truck quite a ways. This was because the seller lived in Tucson. This one lead clicked a whole bunch of the pieces of the investigation into place. It explained why Chuck and Cathy had been going to Tucson, why they had that cashier's check receipt, and even explained why there was a ramp in the bed of their abandoned truck. The couple had likely planned to use this to get their new motorcycle up into the vehicle. Of course, it also brought up a disturbing possibility, that maybe this whole situation with the bike wasn't at all what it appeared to be. By this point, police had already started taking a closer look at the cashier's check receipt. They followed up at Chuck's bank, where they confirmed that he had taken out the check that same day, February 2nd. This was the last activity of any kind on his or Cathy's accounts. A bank employee even remembered helping the couple that day. They told investigators a very similar story to the motorcycle shop owner. During the transaction, Chuck had mentioned something about heading down to Tucson to purchase a motorcycle. Bank employees verified for detectives that the $12,000 check had not been deposited. They were also able to give them the name of the person that the check had been made out to. That name was Tony Nentari. Authorities didn't recognize the name, so they began looking into it to see what they could find. They also started investigating the classified ad that the motorcycle shop owner tipped them off about. They were quickly able to locate the ad, which had been placed in the newspaper The Arizona Republic towards the end of January. The number provided in the ad was cross-referenced with Chuck and Cathy's phone records. Sure enough, they showed that Chuck had called this number twice on February 2nd. The first call was in the morning and had lasted a few minutes, while the second was much shorter and had been made that afternoon. Police concluded that the first conversation was likely Chuck calling to get details about the Ducati motorcycle and hammering out a price. The second was confirming a spot to meet up and carry out the deal. Detectives were positive that they were on the right track. They believed that whatever happened to Chuck and Cathy, it was almost certainly related to this mysterious ad. The only thing left to do now was to continue following this trail of clues, which they hoped would lead them to the person behind it. However, that turned out to be easier said than done. When police looked into Tony Nantari, they discovered that no person by that name existed. They tried every variation of the name they could think of. Anthony Nantari, Antonio Nantari, but none of these returned anything either. The classified ad was a similar story. The ad had been paid for with a money order that had another false name attached, Jose Hernandez. The employee who sold the classified couldn't remember anything about the transaction, and the person hadn't been caught on surveillance cameras at the Arizona Republic building. The number attached to the ad was likewise linked to a prepaid burner phone that had only been active for about a month and had since been shut off. After discovering all of this, detectives were completely convinced that Chuck and Cathy were the victims of foul play. It looked like whoever was behind this newspaper ad was deliberately trying to lure in unsuspecting people, and that the missing couple had fallen into this terrifying trap. This unknown suspect had covered their tracks incredibly well, so much so that as much as authorities didn't want to admit it, they were now at a dead end. In the meantime, detectives tried to reassure Chuck and Cathy's friends and family that they would continue to press forward no matter what. Still, no one was prepared for just how long it would take to finally get the answers they were searching for. When detectives investigating the disappearances of Chuck Russell and Cathy Nelson hit that brick wall in the case back in the spring of 2002, everyone hoped that it was only going to be a temporary setback. Despite the disturbing circumstances, loved ones did their best to try and remain positive and proactive. In addition to handing out thousands of flyers, friends and family held events to raise money for an award for any information. An initial $1,000 was provided by a local Pima County tip line program. But by April of that year, this had ballooned to $15,000 thanks to these fundraising efforts and contributions from Chuck and Cathy's workplaces. On top of this, an Arizona-based media company donated several large billboards in Phoenix and Tucson so that large versions of the couple's missing persons posters could be put up. Multiple candlelight vigils were held, each time with the hopes that it would be the last one necessary before Chuck and Cathy were safely returned home. The sentiment was perhaps best captured by Cathy's father, who said at one event while standing in the parking lot where their truck had been found, quote, "God works miracles, and we feel there's a miracle that could be worked here. We're still praying for that miracle. We're not giving up, we're keeping the negative thoughts out of our mind, and we're going to keep going." However, as days turned to weeks, weeks turned to months, and months finally turned to years, this became harder and harder to do. In interviews we came across during our research, family members talked about the heartbreaking reality of living with this uncertainty for so long. The way that their ears would perk up anytime news was released about a missing persons case, only to find themselves disappointed all over again. About the way they constantly tried to come up with their own theories about what had happened, but were haunted by the fact that they could never truly know. Cathy's other sister, Diane Davidson, talked about how she would come up with wild explanations in her head to cope. Things like that maybe Chuck and Cathy were in witness protection somewhere. In her heart, she knew it wasn't true, but she needed to tell herself something. Others eventually found their way to a place of dark acceptance. In another interview, Chuck's brother Curtis said that he came to terms with the fact that Chuck and Cathy were probably gone forever around the 10-year anniversary of their disappearances. As awful as all of this was, detectives were true to their word. They never gave up on the investigation and continued working behind the scenes for well over a decade. As it turned out, it was this persistence that would finally solve the case. So, as I mentioned before, when Chuck and Cathy's pickup truck was found, there were those initial discoveries in the glove box that helped police to find the trail of clues related to the phony newspaper ad. But the truck itself was also sent away for further forensic analysis. That analysis uncovered touch DNA samples that had been left behind in multiple places in the vehicle's interior, including on an armrest, a seat lever, and on the truck's turn signal arm. All of the samples belonged to the same unknown man. Understandably, as soon as detectives learned this, the unknown DNA was submitted to the CODIS database. Unfortunately, back in 2002, no matches were found. Police were persistent though, and they kept periodically rechecking the DNA. After more than 12 years, they got a match. It was to a 44-year-old man named Brian Ferry. Now, of course, this was a huge break when it finally happened, but detectives were careful not to get ahead of themselves. After all, they had been here before where it looked like the case was on the precipice of being solved, and it was crushing when they hit that dead end. On top of this, Brian Ferry's name had never come up in the investigation prior to this. They had to consider the possibility that he had simply come across Chuck and Cathy's abandoned truck before it was found and had tried to steal it. Especially because, while Brian had a criminal record, he had never been arrested for anything violent. Detectives started off by bringing Brian in for questioning. They only asked him about the vehicle, which he denied ever being inside or having anything to do with. Police knew he was lying, but they decided to let it go for the time being. They didn't want to tip their hand with the DNA evidence just yet. Instead, after finishing the interview, they started speaking to people that knew Brian and looking further into his background. These conversations were a lot more productive. Multiple people recalled Brian acting really strange around the time that Chuck and Cathy had gone missing. In particular, they remembered that he had done a bunch of unusual home repairs. Things like replacing carpets and drywall inside his residence. This was despite the fact that the place was brand new. When investigators looked a little more into Brian's criminal history, something else jumped out. He had been involved in auto thefts, ones that shared some disturbing similarities with the disappearance case. Specifically, he had stolen vehicles from people who had placed ads for them in local papers. He would show up after arranging meetings with victims, ask for a test drive, and then take off. Police wondered, had Brian simply reversed the scheme on Chuck and Cathy, posing as a seller instead of a buyer? Deciding to follow up on the tips about the home repairs, investigators went to the house where Brian Ferry was living back in February of 2002. They were in luck. He had since sold the address, and the new owners were more than happy to let authorities look around. When they did, it didn't take long for them to find what they were searching for. Parts of a wall where it appeared that the drywall had been patched in multiple places. Detectives cut this section from the wall, and what they found was stunning. Not only were these patches covering what were unmistakably bullet holes, there was actually still a .45 caliber bullet lying behind the drywall between the studs of the house. The discovery was as heartbreaking as it was illuminating. They were now sure that Chuck and Cathy had been murdered, and this was almost certainly the place where it had happened. As compelling as all of this was, detectives knew that they needed more if they were ever going to be able to take the case to court. Thankfully, it wasn't long after this that they got one final lucky break. Towards the end of 2014, a surprise witness came forward and said that they wanted to speak with investigators. That witness was Brian Ferry's father, John Ferry. What he had to say was nothing short of horrifying. John told police that back in February of 2002, he had been approached by his son, who said that he needed assistance hauling some heavy items to a nearby dump. On the day that he went to help Brian, everything they moved was in tarps. They loaded everything into a truck and drove it to the Los Reales landfill on the southeastern outskirts of Tucson. At the time, John said he hadn't thought much of the situation. He was told that they were carrying palm tree trunks and a few other random items.
Did you ever see anything while you were loading it up that looked like two bodies?
No.
The father said that it wasn't until years later, when Brian got out of prison for an unrelated crime, that he told him the truth about that visit to the dump. He confessed that he had killed 2 people, and that what they had really been disposing of that day were their remains.
Why did he tell you that he did that?
I guess he wanted to get it off his chest. The bodies were wrapped up and they were thrown into the dump.
Following this stunning admission, detectives finally had enough to arrest and charge Brian Ferry with the murders of Chuck Russell and Cathy Nelson. He was taken into custody in January of 2015, nearly 13 years after they had first gone missing. Sadly, because so much time had passed, it was virtually impossible to find the couple's bodies. By this point, the remains would have been lost under more than a decade's worth of garbage. This also meant that authorities were going to be fighting an uphill battle in court. Despite this, prosecutors did their best to lay out their theory of the case when the proceedings began in January of 2018. They argued that Brian Ferry had lured Chuck and Cathy to Tucson under the guise of getting a great deal on that Ducati motorcycle. However, that motorcycle never existed. Instead, it was Brian's plan to rob the couple for the $12,000 that they had agreed to bring to purchase the fake vehicle. Chuck and Cathy had met Brian at his house, where they had been invited inside to make them feel more comfortable. But this is where things had gone wrong. Instead of bringing cash like Brian wanted, Chuck brought a cashier's check made out to the fake name that he had provided, Tony Nentari. Of course, because of this, Brian couldn't take the money, but he also felt he couldn't let the couple leave because they had seen his face. He shot and killed both of them inside the house before taking steps to cover up what had happened. It seemed that he had thought of everything. That was, until he left his DNA inside of the couple's truck when he abandoned it in the church parking lot. Perhaps the most horrifying part of the prosecution's theory was that in the end, all of this had been pointless. Brian never got his money, and Chuck and Cathy lost their lives for nothing. Brian continued to maintain his innocence, and his first trial ended with the jury deadlocked at 9-3 in favor of conviction. However, when he was tried again several months later, he was found guilty. According to both investigators and Chuck and Cathy's families, it was the testimony of Brian's father, John, which ultimately saved the case. Several people said it was gut-wrenching to watch John, who was clearly emotional, testify against his own son, but that a conviction probably never would have happened without him. Unfortunately, it's debatable as to whether justice was ever actually served, because before Brian Ferry could be sentenced, he took his own life while in prison. He was found dead in his cell on June 16, 2018, at the Pima County Adult Detention Complex. Even though Brian Ferry never really ended up serving time for the terrible crime he committed, I have to say, I admire the way that Chuck and Cathy's loved ones handled the situation. As they had done since the beginning, they managed to remain hopeful and to find the silver lining in all of it. In interviews we came across, several of them stated that they were of course devastated by the fact that they were robbed of the opportunity to properly confront the man that had taken so much from them. All the same, they pointed out that this also spared them the emotional toll of future appeals and allowed them the space to finally close this terrible chapter of their lives. In a letter published in a local paper, Cathy's parents thanked all of those who had helped them through the unimaginable ordeal, writing in part, quote, "We are very much grateful for your support in so many ways." At the time of this recording, the bodies of Cathy Nelson and Chuck Russell still have yet to be found. Before we wrap up, we just wanted to give a huge shout out to everyone who made it this far into the video. As always, we hope you found today's story interesting and informative. A huge thanks as well to today's sponsor, BetterHelp. Don't forget to check out the link in the description below to take advantage of their special discount when you sign up for your first month. If you're looking for additional ways to support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on screen. Once again, thanks so much everyone, and take care.